The sky over downtown Atlanta was the color of wet concrete, a flat gray that made the courthouse's granite facade look even heavier. The building stood like a fortress, its columns worn smooth from decades of weather, its bronze double doors polished to a dull glow. At the top of the steps, lawyers, clerks, and defendants filed in, each with their own rhythm, some brisk with purpose, others slow, reluctant. Inside, the air shifted immediately, cooler, drier, tinged with the faint scent of floor polish and the paper musk of case files stacked somewhere out of sight. The marble floors reflected the light from tall windows, and every footstep echoed with a hollow, deliberate sound. Marcus Ellison stepped into courtroom 5B with the careful composure of someone trying to mask first-day nerves. At 27, he was tall, with the kind of lean build that made his suit hang neatly, though his shoulders held a hint of tension. His suit was navy, crisply pressed, his tie a modest charcoal knot. Under his arm, a leather portfolio, the good kind, the one you only buy when you're sure this is the career you're committing to. He paused just inside the door, taking in the room. The judge's bench loomed high at the far end, an expanse of dark wood carved with the state seal. The gallery's wooden pews gleamed under the overhead lights, their varnish a little too shiny to be comfortable. The low hum of quiet conversation filled the air. Defense attorneys leaning toward clients, the court reporter checking her equipment, the bailiff scanning the room with practiced detachment. Marcus walked to the defense table, set his portfolio down, and began arranging his notes with precision, motions stacked in order, citations tabbed with yellow flags, pen uncapped and ready. He inhaled once, quietly steadying himself. The bailiff's voice cut through the air. "All rise." The room stood as Judge Meredith Cole entered. She was in her mid-60s, tall for her age, her black robe flowing behind her as she ascended the bench. Her silver hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her glasses rested low on her nose, allowing her to peer over them with an expression that was equal parts disapproval and authority. She gave a curt nod, and everyone sat. Cole shuffled through a few files, her rings tapping against the wood as she flipped pages. "Case of State versus Ramirez," the bailiff announced. Marcus rose, buttoning his jacket. "Good morning, Your Honor. Marcus Ellison, Public Defender's Office, appearing on behalf of the defendant." Judge Cole looked up for the first time, her gaze sweeping over him in one quick pass, the way someone might glance at an object they weren't planning to keep. "Mr. Ellison," she said, drawing out his name, "how long have you been practicing?" Marcus hesitated, unsure where this was going. "This is my first month with the PD's office, Your Honor, but I see," she said, cutting him off. "That explains the tentativeness." He tried again. "If I may proceed with—" "No," she interrupted again, her tone firm. "Before you proceed, let me be clear. In my courtroom, I expect preparation. I expect clarity. I expect lawyers to know what they're doing." "I am prepared, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady but respectful. She leaned forward slightly, her glasses catching the light. "We'll see. I've been on this bench longer than you've been alive, and I can smell incompetence before the first word leaves a lawyer's mouth." A faint ripple of murmurs traveled through the gallery. The prosecutor smirked without looking up from his notes. Marcus held his ground, resisting the urge to shift his weight. "With respect, Your Honor, I'd like to—" "Watch your tone," she said sharply, "and remember where you are." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Marcus felt the room shrink, not from fear, but from the realization that this wasn't going to be a fair fight. He gripped his pen a little tighter, glancing down at his notes. Somewhere behind him, a faint rustle of movement came from the back row of the courtroom, but he didn't turn. Not yet. The case had barely begun, before Judge Meredith Cole started cutting into Marcus's presentation like a knife through soft bread. He rose from the defense table, adjusting his tie with one hand, and began outlining his motion to suppress a piece of evidence. His voice was steady, his phrasing careful, the product of hours of preparation. "Your Honor, pursuant to—" "Mr. Ellison," she interrupted without looking up from the file in front of her, "what exactly are you attempting to accomplish here?" Marcus blinked once, recalibrating. "To establish that the search conducted on—" Cole held up her hand. "Spare me the lecture. Get to the point. My time is valuable. From the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Harold Price smirked, glancing down at his own notes, as if this performance were an afternoon's entertainment. Marcus inhaled through his nose, flipped to the relevant page, and tried again. The officers lacked probable cause for the traffic stop, and as such, "Did you even read the police report, Mr. Ellison?" Cole's voice rose slightly, carrying to the back row of the gallery. "Yes, Your Honor," and she leaned back in her chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Because it sounds to me like you're reciting something you pulled from a legal textbook, not presenting an argument grounded in the facts of this case." A quiet ripple of laughter, quickly stifled, came from somewhere in the back of the gallery. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone level. "With respect, I'm prepared to address the specific facts." Cole's gavel tapped twice, sharp and impatient. "And I'm prepared to move this along before you waste any more of the court's time." Marcus could feel the defendant beside him shift uncomfortably, their faith in his ability eroding in real time under the judge's public dismantling. The next 20 minutes were a slow-motion grind. Every legal citation Marcus offered was challenged before he could finish it. Every attempt to read from the record was met with a pointed question, delivered just loud enough for the jury box, currently empty for motions, to have heard it had they been seated. Cole's tone alternated between mock pity and surgical precision. "Mr. Ellison, you might want to consider a less demanding area of practice," she said at one point, arranging papers on her bench as if the matter were already closed. "Something where you won't be in over your head quite so quickly." Marcus didn't flinch. His pen moved quietly over the yellow legal pad in front of him, not transcribing every word, but marking key phrases, jotting times, noting tone. On the top of the page, in small block letters, he had already written, "Courtroom demeanor. Observations." When the motion was finally denied, Cole didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. "Perhaps next time, Mr. Ellison, you'll come in better prepared," she said, dismissing him with a flick of her hand. Marcus gathered his papers without comment, his movements precise, almost slow. Behind him, in the back row, Jonathan Parks, the tall man in the gray suit, crossed one leg over the other, his expression unreadable. But Marcus knew he had been watching every moment, and Marcus knew, as he slid the last page into his portfolio, that this morning's work had only just begun. The courtroom was quieter now, the morning's heat having settled into a slow simmer. A few spectators had slipped out during the last case, leaving the gallery more sparsely populated. But in the farthest row, almost blending into the wood-paneled wall, Jonathan Parks hadn't moved an inch. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit with a subtle herringbone weave, his tie a dark, understated blue. His posture was relaxed, one arm draped casually over the back of the bench, but his eyes were sharp, tracking every movement at the defense table, every change in the judge's tone. Marcus, at the defense table, didn't need to turn around to know Jonathan was there. He had felt his presence the moment he walked into courtroom 5B. He could almost sense that steady gaze at the back of his neck. The case file in front of Marcus was now neatly closed, resting on top of his leather portfolio. He didn't reach for it again. Instead, he kept his pen in his hand, writing occasional, concise notes on a small notepad he'd positioned slightly to the left, out of Judge Cole's direct line of sight. Cole interrupts counsel repeatedly. Tone. Dismissive. Uses public criticism instead of sidebar. He underlined the last phrase twice, then glanced briefly toward the prosecution table. Ada Harold Price was still wearing that thin smirk, as if the morning had been nothing more than a bit of theater in which Marcus had been the hapless understudy. Jonathan's expression didn't change, but his right hand tapped once on his knee, a small, almost imperceptible signal to Marcus. A reminder. Stay the course. No one else in the courtroom knew why Marcus was really here. To them, he was just another junior attorney cutting his teeth in front of a notoriously tough judge. They didn't know about the closed-door meeting 2 weeks ago in the governor's private office, where Jonathan had laid out the assignment in a low, measured voice. "You'll be appearing on a real case," Jonathan had said. "It's not a staged scenario. But your primary task isn't to win or lose. It's to observe Judge Meredith Cole, her conduct, her treatment of counsel, her adherence to decorum. We've had complaints. The governor wants an evaluation from someone he trusts. Marcus had frowned. You could send any observer from judicial oversight. Jonathan's gaze had sharpened. We could, but we want someone she won't suspect is there to evaluate her. Someone she'll treat like any other newcomer, without filters. He had let the words hang there for a beat before adding, You're not just a junior lawyer, Marcus. You're the governor's son, and that makes you the one person whose report will land directly on his desk. Now, in courtroom 5B, Marcus glanced down at his watch. The morning session was nearly over. The last case on the docket was being called, but Judge Cole's voice still carried the same sharpness it had when she'd been addressing him, that pointed, impatient edge that seemed less about moving cases along and more about asserting dominance. Jonathan shifted slightly, leaning forward just enough to rest his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the bench. Marcus returned his gaze to the notepad, adding one final line before closing it. Pattern established. Further confirmation likely in chambers. As the bailiff called for a recess, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room. Marcus began stacking his papers, his expression calm, deliberate. He didn't look back at Jonathan, but he felt the unspoken exchange pass between them. This isn't over yet. The bailiff's voice echoed through the nearly empty courtroom. Mr. Ellison, Judge Cole would like to see you in chambers. Marcus looked up from his portfolio, his face composed but unreadable. I'll be right there, he said, sliding his pen into the loop on his notepad. From the back row, Jonathan Parks didn't move, but his eyes tracked Marcus as he walked toward the side door behind the bench. There was no nod, no visible signal, just a subtle tightening of his jaw. Marcus stepped through the door and into a short hallway, the sounds of the courtroom fading behind him. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish and old paper, and at the end of it, a single door stood ajar. The frosted glass panel bore gold stenciling. Judge Meredith Cole. He knocked once, lightly. Come in, Cole's voice called, firm and clipped. Inside, the chambers were everything you'd expect from a long-serving judge. Shelves lined with law books in deep burgundy and navy bindings, framed certificates from law school, bar associations, and judicial appointments. A wall-mounted clock ticking steadily in the background. The blinds were partially closed, letting in slanted beams of pale afternoon light that cut across her desk. Cole sat behind that desk, her robe still on, reading glasses perched low on her nose. She didn't look up immediately, instead, shuffling a few papers into a neat pile before fixing her gaze on Marcus. Mr. Ellison, she began, leaning back in her chair, you had a rough morning. Marcus remained standing. I had a morning, Your Honor. One corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, exactly. I'm hard on all young lawyers, especially those who come into my courtroom looking like they need hand-holding. If you want to last in this profession, you'll need thicker skin. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Feedback noted. Cole's tone softened by a fraction, though her eyes still carried that sharpness. Don't take it personally. My job isn't to coddle incompetence. It's to run a courtroom that works. Marcus let a moment of silence stretch, then stepped forward. He set his leather portfolio on the desk and unfastened the clasp with a quiet click. From inside, he withdrew a large envelope, cream-colored and heavy stock, sealed with a crimson wax crest. The gold embossing on the flap caught the light. Office of the Governor, State of Georgia. He placed it gently in front of her. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What is this? A letter from Governor Samuel Ellison, Marcus said evenly. Cole looked from the envelope to Marcus, then back again. And why would the governor be sending me a letter through you? Marcus's gaze held hers, steady. Because I'm not only a public defender, Your Honor, I'm also his son. The judge's expression didn't change immediately. It froze, as if her mind needed a second to catch up to what she'd just heard. Then, she reached for the envelope, breaking the wax seal with a fingernail. The paper inside rustled as she unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the words, scanning quickly at first, then slowing. The lines were brief but clear. Marcus Ellison has been assigned to observe and evaluate judicial performance in select courts. Your courtroom is one of them. When she looked up, the color in her face had shifted, just a shade paler, but enough to be noticeable. You, her voice had lost some of its usual sharpness. You're the governor's son? Marcus nodded once. I am. And I was sent here to see this courtroom exactly as it operates, without any special treatment, which is exactly what I got. The clock on the wall ticked twice in the silence that followed. For a long moment after Marcus spoke, Judge Meredith Cole didn't move. She remained in her high-backed leather chair, letter from the governor still in her hands, but her grip had loosened just enough for the parchment to tremble faintly. The pale afternoon light cutting through the blinds seemed to have shifted, throwing half her face into shadow. She glanced down at the governor's crest again, as if it might have changed while she wasn't looking. You're telling me, she said finally, voice quieter now, that you've been here, evaluating me? Marcus stood calmly in front of her desk, hands lightly clasped in front of him. Yes. Your courtroom was one of several identified for observation this quarter. My role was to document judicial demeanor, professionalism, and adherence to the canons of conduct. Her lips pressed together until they thinned to a single line. You should have told me from the start. That, Marcus said, his tone still even, would have defeated the purpose. Cole leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking softly. You're implying I treated you differently than I should have. I'm not implying anything, Marcus replied. I'm reporting exactly what I saw and experienced, which, for the record, was a pattern of public dismissal, interruption, and personal derision. Not just toward me, toward multiple junior attorneys on today's docket. She shifted uncomfortably, her hands folding on the desk now that the letter was set aside. I have high standards. I expect performance. Marcus tilted his head slightly. High standards are one thing. Humiliation is another. You didn't just question my motions. You questioned whether I should even be in this profession. In front of opposing counsel, in front of my client, and in front of the public gallery. That doesn't serve justice, Your Honor. It undermines it. Her eyes flickered, and for the first time since he'd entered, she looked away. The tick of the clock filled the silence. You've been a judge a long time, Marcus continued, his voice still steady, but with a new firmness underneath. Long enough to know that what happens in this room shapes how people see the law, whether they believe it's fair, whether they believe it respects them. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to agree with me. But you do have to treat the people in front of you with the same dignity you expect for yourself on that bench. Cole's jaw tightened. So, this goes into your report? It does, Marcus said. Word for word, as it happened. The judge inhaled slowly through her nose, her gaze meeting his again. But the steel in her eyes was dulled now, the certainty not quite as absolute. She knew what it meant for the governor's son, acting in an official capacity, to file a negative evaluation. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself the faintest trace of something that could almost be a smile. The thing is, Your Honor, this isn't about me. I'm going to leave this room and go on with my career. But the next young lawyer who stands at that table shouldn't have to choose between advocating for their client and bracing for a public takedown. Cole didn't answer. She sat there, the folded letter on her desk, like a weight neither of them could ignore. Marcus gathered the envelope and slid it neatly back into his portfolio, though the letter was no longer a secret. The governor's crest had already burned itself into Judge Meredith Cole's mind. She wouldn't forget it any time soon. She sat still behind her desk, but her posture had shifted, the rigid, almost regal spine now leaning back into the leather chair, as if the weight of the revelation had pressed her there. Mr. Ellison, she began, but then stopped. The formality of his surname felt awkward now, almost brittle. Marcus looked at her evenly. Yes, Your Honor? Her fingers tapped once on the blotter before she laced them together again. I may have been overly firm with you today. The words sounded as if they had been pried loose, each one slightly reluctant to leave her mouth. Firm is one thing, Marcus replied. Public humiliation is another. He paused, letting the weight of the silence settle. You have an audience every day in this room. Lawyers, defendants, jurors, citizens. Every person who walks out of here leaves with an impression of what justice looks like. Today, a lot of people walked out believing it's condescending and cruel. Cole's lips pressed together, but she didn't challenge him. The quiet in the room was thick, broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock. Marcus closed his portfolio and adjusted his jacket. "My father will receive my report within the week," he said, his tone matter of fact. "I'll make sure it includes the facts. Nothing more, nothing less." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and crossed the room to the door. When he stepped into the hallway, the light seemed brighter. The faint murmur of court staff talking at the far end carried through the corridor. And there, leaning casually against the wall near the entrance to the courtroom, was Jonathan Parks. Jonathan straightened as Marcus approached. "Everything go as expected?" he asked in a low voice. Marcus gave a single nod. "Exactly as expected." Jonathan didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. The look on Marcus's face told him enough. Together they walked down the hall toward the elevators. Neither man looked back toward Chambers, but if they had, they might have seen Judge Cole still seated behind her desk, staring at the letter like it was a verdict she hadn't been prepared to hear. As the elevator doors closed, Marcus glanced at Jonathan. "She knows now," he said simply. Jonathan allowed the faintest flicker of a smile. "Good. That was the point." Back in her office, Judge Cole turned the governor's letter over in her hands again. The gold seal caught the light from the blinds, almost accusatory in its gleam. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering whether the way she ran her courtroom had just shifted from an asset to a liability. 2 weeks later, the Georgia Judicial Review Committee released its quarterly report. It came out quietly, posted online at 6 a.m. on a rainy Thursday, the kind of morning when most people were more concerned with umbrellas than state oversight. But in legal circles, it hit like a cold wind. Buried halfway through the 60-page document, under the section Judicial Conduct and Courtroom Management, was a 3-paragraph evaluation of Courtroom 5B, Judge Meredith Cole presiding. The language was measured, but the implications were unmistakable. While Judge Cole demonstrates deep legal knowledge and efficiency in case management, observation reveals a consistent pattern of dismissive and unnecessarily combative conduct toward less experienced counsel. Such behavior risks undermining public confidence in judicial fairness and discouraging the professional development of new attorneys. Recommendations: formal judicial conduct training, unannounced observation periods over the next 12 months. By noon, word had spread through the courthouse. In the break room of the public defender's office, 3 attorneys were huddled over a laptop, reading the section aloud in hushed voices. Someone let out a low whistle. "Looks like somebody finally put it in writing," one of them murmured. At a corner table, Marcus Ellison sat with a cup of coffee cooling beside him, his leather portfolio closed at his elbow. He'd already read the report at home that morning, scrolling through it in the quiet before sunrise. It hadn't surprised him. He'd written most of the underlying notes that fed into it. But seeing it laid out in formal, public language carried a weight of finality. Across from him, a colleague leaned forward. "You really did a number on her, huh?" Marcus shook his head slowly. I didn't do a number on anyone. I just described what happened. The rest was her own work." Outside, the rain drummed against the tall courthouse windows, turning the glass into a moving gray blur. Somewhere on the other side of the building, in chambers that were suddenly much quieter than usual, Judge Cole was no doubt reading the report herself, and realizing that she was no longer untouchable. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. In 30 minutes, he had another hearing. Different courtroom, different judge. He gathered his papers and stood, slipping the portfolio under his arm. As he walked out, his colleague called after him, "Hey, Marcus, think she'll change?" He didn't break stride. "That's on her," he said. In the hallway, the familiar echo of his footsteps on marble followed him toward the elevator. His work here was done, but the bigger job of making sure justice didn't depend on who you were or how long you'd been in the game, was far from over. And somewhere deep in courtroom 5B, under the shadow of the bench, a single gold-sealed letter still sat in the top drawer of Judge Cole's desk. a quiet reminder of the day she'd been seen for exactly who she was.